Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we all enjoyed our lunches. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. First of all, Tony Cioni. He's our first speaker, and he has lived around the world in St. Petersburg, in post-Soviet Russia. He's lived in Kuwait, in Kazakhstan, and now in Canada. Tony built his career in energy law, specializing in domestic and international E&P development. And with over 20 years of international experience, Tony's work has touched over 40 countries, which is amazing to say. He's fluent in Russian and French, and he's called in Alberta and England, and he is listed in the for energy in Chambers and International Who's Who. He's currently a board member and the secretary of the Association of International Petroleum Negotiators. Pat Cunningham, our second speaker, has an equally diverse background. He grew up as a child in Peru speaking Spanish, and he got an authentic understanding of the Latin American region. Pat has worked in North Africa and the Middle East, including 10 years in Cairo, where he became fluent in Arabic. And he joined Talisman, running the country's business development initiatives for over 20 years in the Middle East, Africa, and in Latin America. Pat has negotiated with governments in Cuba, Libya, Iran, and North Korea. He specializes in upstream and oil service business development with an emphasis on Latin America, the Middle East, and North Africa. In addition to Talisman, Pat's also worked for Plus Petrol, Amoco Europe, and Getty Texaco. So please join me in welcoming them both.
Who feels a little bit weird today being in a room? I've done a lot of public speaking. I'm never nervous about it, but I guess you push the pause button for public events for a number of months. It's bizarre. But we did want to thank the PGAVA for hosting us, in particular restarting what is hopefully a trend of public presentation of data again that I'm sure you guys have been on a lot of webinars we have. Okay. They're just not quite the same as this is in person when you get the opportunity. I guess the focus of today's talk is an examination of kind of where we are in Canada. I promise I left my soapbox at home. It might come out a little bit on energy policy in this country. But taking account of where we're at and then looking at various opportunities abroad, and in particular, Pat and I thought it would be useful to examine how we consider each country that we're helping clients look at. Like, what are the criteria? What do we look at? How do we pour that through the colander to decide what may be a fit-for-purpose opportunity or, frankly, what's just a bad idea? By the way, this is a metro map we constructed of every country we've done work in. We thought it was pretty nifty looking. So this is the part where I promise not to get too solidly on the soapbox, but you see there's a bit of invective here. The gullible beaver. How do we end up here is usually the question that gets asked. My answer to that is that it has been the culmination of a series of failures, car crashes, if you will, in terms of federal and provincial policy on the energy file. When we read the newspaper and we read about, will Keystone XL happen or will it not happen, for example, what is often missing in the narrative is the role Canada plays in the overall geopolitical energy system. And I think as a nation, we don't understand that narrative very well as the average Canadian. And then it's not surprising that our political parties don't understand it very well because they're pulled from the same population the rest of us are pulled from. So when you put those two key bits of lack of understanding together, you get some aberrant results. In particular, in my view, government policy that is obstructing development. I'm sure there'd be a lot of agreement around the room on that point, but if you look at policy initiatives that governments might want to pursue, for example, lowering the carbon footprint, Canada certainly could have played a role in that in a very positive way in terms of ethical Canadian gas being delivered from LNG, as an example. But because we didn't get the narrative around geopolitics, we sort of literally missed the boat on that one. And so that's where the obstruction comes in to really hurt us. Combine that with what I would regard to be some unrealistic notions around the speed and efficacy of energy transition technology, and you've kind of got a gap now where we seem to be politically putting one industry in the recycle bin before we've really got the other one up and running. So those are obvious challenges to everybody in the room. Throw on top of that COVID in 2020, and you've got an additional warped mirror to look at the problem through. Obviously, massive government spending is going to dictate paying the piper at some point. So I think these are the kind of factors that we see in clients examining their business, whether that's upstream, midstream, or oil and gas service, with the realization that, well, if I keep doing exactly what I have been doing for the last 10 years, where's my prospectivity? There's a runway problem here. And the answer to the runway problem is clearly in diversification, either by industry sector. In fact, we've got a client here today who has a very able piece of magnetic filtration technology that has great application in oil and gas contexts, but he's looking at applying them in other industries as an example of diversifying the risk. But whether you're diversified on industry or not, the second factor comes in, and this is why we're here today, which is geographic diversification. Canada, it turns out, is a good place to prove that an idea works. It's not necessarily the best place to commercialize that idea because we're a small market. And so we see that over and over again with our client base. So before moving on, I thought I'd just depress you with a few more slides. So these statements I'm showing you are actually from a 2017 report. So if you could imagine that's what that data looked like in 2017. 2020 has not improved the picture. The fact that we've been losing market share on the oil file, if we'll call it that, for years has been something well established. I think the balance of the year 2020 has just seen the aggregation of those opportunities in the hands of Russia and Saudi Arabia. The picture we get is one of international investment leaving Canada, and in fact, just capital investment in general falling. So these are from the Canadian Energy Centre. Here's the foreign investment picture from 2017. You can imagine the negative bar was going to be a lot deeper for 2020. And, this is where we get to the point that I left off at, which is really the Canadian capital is going to have to look for better netback and volume opportunities. One thing we have seen in countries like Iraq, for example, the Canadian brand still sells quite well abroad. So for an oil service company going into a foreign country, we are well received in general in terms of the perception of a high standard or high quality of service or goods from a jurisdiction that has a high standard of environmental regulation, for example. So that's helpful. A low Canadian dollar certainly helps. There's a lot of countries around the world. I'll pick Iraq again, where investors are tired of large bills from the Bechtels or the Schlumbergers of the universe. So that's an opportunity. And of course, the last point, Canadian capital may well have to avoid the high tax jurisdiction story that is coming our way. So this is where Pat and I start to trade off on the microphone a little bit. If you've got to the point where you've said to yourself, gee, the runway looks a bit dicey, what should we be looking at? The pattern we often see with international business development, for those who are new to it, is dipping a toe in, maybe going to a conference, these days doing a webinar, getting a notion of an opportunity abroad, and then pursuing that one opportunity immediately. The tricky thing about entrepreneurialism is it requires both opportunism and diligence. And so one thing we often see, Pat, is sort of skipping over the diligence step, going straight to the opportunity. But there are a few factors about the diligence that are worth exploring here today. You know, when you're looking at that opportunity, there are a few things you have to realize in terms of the risk profile itself. The first is that your own organization may or may not have the skill sets required to wrestle the alligator, so to speak. So to give you an example, a small company with a fairly flat G&A may or may not have the expertise in-house to deal with international tax issues. So if you were doing a SWOT analysis, as we often recommend our clients do first, you know, these are the holes that are best to be identified and plugged. Similarly, then looking at what you're good at doing and vectoring that in that direction. You know, in considering the SWOT analysis, the O in SWOT being opportunities tends to be where companies get fixated and they forget the S and the W and the T. So I think the takeaway that we've observed is there's a lot of value in just sitting down with a pen and a piece of paper and your colleagues to work that out first. The other thing is mentioned, international requires a lot of different skills. Tax is just one example. Cultural skills, language skills. How are we going to get the money out? Well, will we get EDC to insure it? Do we have any experience getting insurance products like that, et cetera? FCPA or foreign corruption issues are something that you've got to be aware of. So when doing that SWOT analysis, it's useful to ask yourself whether your business actually has these skills. And if you don't, then, you know, figuring out where you're going to get them is a key question to ask yourself. Otherwise, you could launch at the opportunity, get, you know, 10 steps down the road and then figure out that a whole bunch of major diligence items actually haven't been dealt with properly. And we do get brought in sometimes to deal with the car crash after it's happened. And unfortunately, that's a lot more expensive scenario to work out than just having plotted it out a bit more carefully in the first place. And so, you know, I think the last point, which sets the table for the rest of the presentation today, is, well, what factors should one consider when you're looking at that opportunity? There's obviously the opportunity itself in terms of a project, for example, with a potential payout. But what lurks behind that project in each one of these countries is an entire set of criteria that can erode the security of your return. These things vary quite a bit from country to country, depending on history, politics, et cetera. And there's a fair degree of subjectivity that can be applied even when judging whether they're a big risk or not. So at this point, I might get Pat to come in.
Yeah, the real issue here is that Tony just mentioned something that probably is underestimated. I don't think that I've ever gone into a client's offices, be it E&P or oilfield services or some other hybrid, that has not that has gone through a proper, rigorous process. I don't think a single company or a single client has ever done a SWOT analysis. In fact, I would actually say in my precursor companies, we didn't do them either. I think there's a general culture of not doing these things, and as they're really dead simple, they're a bit, shall we say, burdensome. But out of this, if you don't have a good set of strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities, you can't really look at these type of country risk analysis without that context. I think that really is critical. Such a simple exercise. It may take you 2 or 3 days to do it, but if there's a takeaway to this, you got to do that before you move on to this part of the story. Just these variables that we use, we normally use anything between 10 and 17 variables, and they're not meant to be highly either academically driven, because we don't want to fall into the quagmire of the type of research that's done for the likes of Moody's, Fitch, credit risk people. That is way above any of the standards that you require to get either an E&P contract, a service contract, or joint venture agreement sorted out. But you do have to have a degree of granularity or even a qualitative feel to some of these factors. And the biggest value destruction factors are really here. And I've experienced many of these, either through my former lives or even as a teenager, I'll explain to you. But starting from the top, the greatest underestimated variable is access to market, either your oil field services, either you're an oil and gas company wanting into a jurisdiction. And one of the issues that we find here is that people severely underestimate the competition or access to that. And this is a huge topic that will take quite a few lunches to go through. But access to market, we really pay a lot of attention to this in that particular subset that you're in. We assign values to these, and it also allows a certain degree of conversation within the organization that's undertaking this new country entry or joint venture entry. Political stability, the next tier down, political stability, the macroeconomic risk, and the foreign exchange risks and currency controls all gel into one. They're all interrelated. That's why they're placed in a sort of a little mini package. For example, the political systems that you may see in Argentina certainly drive the economic risk. The pendulum nature of the politics drive the risk. And it certainly drives the foreign exchange and their debt, their GDP, and so forth. So this is at a very macro scale that you want to pay attention to, that we pay attention to, but it drives the real issues that you've got to take out of this are questions such as, can I get my money out? Can I get dividends out? In a lot of cases, the answer is no. And those are key macro reasons that drive down to your micro. So you don't need to know, you don't have to be an academic or a conversationalist in GDP ratios, but you do need to know the implications of these. Driving that on more of a societal level, and after all, it's social unrest, as we've seen to our neighbors to the south, that freak markets out. They don't like it. They don't like it in Peru, where you had a change of president 2 days ago, just kicked out. And these type of unrests really affect the value of risk that you assign to this, even though they're so intangible. Corruption, for example, corruption, security, operational drivers, and of course, legal framework, rule of law. Believe me, I have a lawyer in front of me here, but he will also attest to the fact that don't rely upon the legal provisions. Most jurisdictions are highly, shall we, compromised in terms of political interference with the legal process. I'm not pointing to any particular country at the moment, but these are real and live risks. We can give you lots of examples of this. And we tend to package this up. The corruption issue will haunt you to the day that the company goes insolvent. You have to have proper FCPA and Canadian compliant and US compliant regulations to, first of all, to enter a jurisdiction, but certainly to survive in a given jurisdiction. If you're known, for example, as somebody who willingly hands out tens of thousands of dollars to get through the customs, get your equipment in, or bribes politicians, you will never get away from that. It's like the Russian or the Italian mafia. You never get to unknow them, to quote you.
Or the Irish mafia for that purpose. Pat's Irish, by the way.
So it's a lot less sophisticated in their dealings. But this is a key substratum that we also assign values to.
I might just interject there, Pat, on rule of law and Pat's point about naively believing that rule of law will save you. I do like to quote rappers occasionally. Jay-Z says, I bring a gun to a fist fight. And so to unpack that a little bit, thinking about a transaction, a deal, a joint venture, not in terms of me relying on Chapter 7 to make sure that Anita pays my bill, for example, but creating a commercial structure where Anita is so aligned with my interests that she wouldn't dare think about not paying the bill. So you have to restructure your thinking around deals. I call this joint venture architecture. It's really an exercise in psychology and self-interest. That will save you if you do it well. What won't save you is some words on a piece of paper that your counterparty, depending on the country they're from, hasn't even bothered to read because they don't care, right? This is the reality sometimes, so.
Just to move down to the fourth stratum, and this stratum is, and I call them stratum because my background is in geology, and I'm sort of thinking about this, even though access to markets from an E&P perspective would be access to subsurface, which is a bit of a flip on this. But keeping focused on the bottom, expropriation, labor unions, and union relationships, and then community relationships is particularly close to my heart, and especially the expropriation word. And I'll just segue for maybe 30 seconds. As was mentioned, I was brought up as a kid from inception to 16 in South America. And great life, especially in the 60s and early 70s. Beaches, sun, food, a wonderful environment. Until one day there was a military takeover, which totally threw everything to one side. And this was a very bizarre military takeover. It was left of center. Nobody saw it coming. My parents didn't see it coming. My father's company didn't see it coming at all. All my father's company's assets were at the time nationalized. Now we call it expropriation. But on a personal level, all bank accounts with foreign currency in them, such as the Bank of Canada, or it was Bank of Canada at the time in Lima. All my parents' assets were frozen. They were not able to take out a single penny extract in foreign currency. Everything had to be converted to Peruvian soles at the time at an egregiously bad exchange rate. So at the bottom, about a year later, we left with our bags, with all our assets in our bags. Total value destruction, their savings gone. And I can tell you, that really has put me in a mood of being hyper aware about expropriation of assets, major assets. Although I would say to you, there are expropriations and there's small e expropriations. There's other ways to get you other than simply sequestering your assets and not having any commercial access to them. But you would have thought that this would have been the end of it. The rest is history. Well, no. Fast forward to what would have been 1998. I think it was 98 when, in my previous position at Talisman, we acquired a small company here in Calgary called Arrakis Energy that had assets in the Heglig area in southern Sudan. Now, I'm sure every one of you knows about southern Sudan thanks to Talisman. We went into this venture. It was great assets, great operating environment. We were in a joint venture. It was a JV with Chinese partners, Malaysian, and Sudapet. It sounds like a cough mixture, but no, it's the Sudanese National Oil Company and Talisman as an operating group. In this group, we managed to bring up production net to the company to around 60,000 barrels of oil per day. But due to the simmering unrest, the simmering civil war that was ongoing in the Heglig area to the south of what is now southern Sudan, we had investor pressure, shareholder pressure, political pressure put on us, and we had pressure from the House of Representatives. House Bill 1832 was drafted to delist Talisman from the New York Stock Exchange. So I can assure you that my history didn't teach me anything about to look out from the things that you don't see coming. What we really didn't see coming was the politics. We couldn't deal with this politics on the ground, and hence this rolls into the expropriation and moves up into the security operational side. There are certain things where in the heat of the deal, the heat of the trying to get the production sale or the acquisition done, you don't pay enough attention to the obvious. And the conclusions that I came to, there are certain jurisdictions you shouldn't be doing business in. You should not go in there because they're so volatile, they're so unpredictable. Or in the case of, let's say, South America, they swing from left to right on a very cyclical basis. Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Don't even talk to me about Venezuela, the loss of value there. So stuff like this continues to happen. And I've seen it in two good points in my life. And hence, despite all of this instability, there are opportunities where you can mitigate some of these risks and variables, dealing with unions, local communities. We have a client of ours sitting in the room at the moment that deals very effectively with community relations, not perfectly, but very effectively with community relations in South America, because they've got a plan and they've got a strength in that side. Now, I think that given you the flavor of what we evaluate, we then use these type of metrics, and we rank them from -1 to a 5, or you could use a simple stoplight, a green, a yellow, or an amber. It's quite a simple system. This does not have to be complicated. And you could assign values to your risk tolerances. And then when dealing with your contracts, we can mitigate them. We can add what I would call legal mitigants or commercial Kevlar. Would you like to intercede at that point?
Yes, so this is the point where we move from the theoretical matrix to applying it on a region by region basis. And Pat will deal with this in detail in a minute. He says no, but the answer is yes. The other value of this tool, though, is it's a quick thumbnail of what might be obvious but not be obvious. And I think when you do this, when you engage with this sort of thinking, it plugs you well back into your SWOT analysis to figure out, look, if we were going to pursue an opportunity, it ought to look like this. And when you start to compare countries or even opportunities within a country on this kind of basis, you get a visual for what's more likely to look like that thing that you're going to be good at versus not, based on a bit of rigor. And if you are a company that has, as we were talking earlier today about Simon, if you have a queue of opportunities, you're going to want to prioritize those opportunities based on, well, a few things. Return is one of them, but return's not going to help you if you're not going to get your money out. So risking or ranking your opportunities in a fashion that's got some metric and logic to it. So Pat ran, this is basically the Cito mini computer that Pat queued up. Do you guys like how we put access to infrastructure at -1 for Canada?
I hope you all noticed that one. That was deliberate.
In fact, if we wanted to update it today, we might even put Mexico to -1, as the current government there is opposing 7 pipeline projects in Mexico.
In fairness, we started this project with one of our favorite and most loved clients in this room as an experiment to see how applicable it could be used. And it has 2 uses, really. One, to get down and be sort of semi-numeric with it and try to rank, or shoulder to shoulder, who's the taller of these 2 guys, who's the better looking one, who's got the better voice. Those are easy answers, of course. You'll see that it's self-evident. But also, I found there was a secondary effect, almost a parallel one, that it allowed for a discourse within the corporation, within the entity, to really, if you didn't do your SWOT analysis, well, at least this would be a process by which to get opinions out and to get some collective view, some, shall we say, internal debate as to where the risks I can tolerate and where I can enter. And in this particular case, we started, if you go from left to right, Canada, US, Mexico, hence the North America, and then we moved literally geographically south into Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, slight segue to the East Coast, and to Argentina. And it was really, if you look at and as you can see from the top layer, it's geared towards E&P companies. It's got perceived subsurface potential, access to acreage, access to reserves. And in general, you'd say, well, South America is a pretty good place. In fact, in parts, Canada and the States are reasonably good. But certainly in terms of volumetrically and in terms of future potential. The likes of Guyana and Argentina stand out quite measurably here, but we don't want to really home in on these. The real differentiators tend to be access to markets. We know Canada stands out as a bit of a black eye here. Political stability, I would rank, Mexico's going off the Richter scale from 5 to 10 years ago with the introduction, with the new president, Andrés Obrador, coming in. It has flipped the other way. They want to focus on Pemex, they want to focus on the debt reduction in the debt-laden Pemex and their electricity concerns. It's very left of center. This was a surprise to all of us, to such a point that it really, in my view, raises the specter of potential reneging on contract. And there has been hints within the political circles within Mexico City, for example, of actual expropriation if they don't get their way, as a threat, as a tool, rather than I'm going to expropriate to operate. So it's become a very surprising, in a very short period of time, a surprisingly negative foreign investment landing place. I mean, here's a really good contrast. This is Latin America. We all sort of, we speak the same language. We sort of support the same football teams, the same religion, no religious divide, as opposed to where I come from in Northern Ireland, where we do emphasize that. But this is a fairly unified place, but there's such a divergence here in political stability, corruption, security. One would have thought that, maybe 10 years ago, Colombia would never look so good. Colombia is a paragon of stability by comparison. It does have its infrastructure issues, transportation issues. There are superb systems put in place, very modern, to get your customs, you get your equipment in, contracts vetted. You go to the consulate here, Colombian consulate, everything will be scanned and publicly available. The transparency and their effort towards annihilating or getting rid of corruption is commendable in Colombia, as opposed to Mexico, which is frankly a basket case in terms of security. Ever tried to operate in the Burgos area onshore Mexico? You're asking for trouble. If you look like me, I speak the language absolutely perfectly. I stand out, my blue eyes and white skin, I am a target. You cannot use the likes of me on the ground. You have to get Mexican partners, Mexican JVs. Those are key entries to success. You have to know what the operational challenges are. Please don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because hiding out in some little grovelly place in the Burgos area waiting for somebody to rescue you is not a pretty sight, and living on Chiapas.
I think this raises an important point, Pat, which is all of these countries can present opportunities. And in fact, when we help clients do this analysis, the answer is do go to this country, don't go to this country. That's really not the nature of the analysis. It's if you're going to go to a country like Mexico, given its drawbacks, what is the smartest way to do it? Argentina has got some, I would say, similar issues driven by different factors. So it's not that we think you shouldn't go to Mexico or you shouldn't go to Argentina, but there's a dumb way to do this and there's a smarter way to do this. And if you haven't done the diligence, you may not be aware of those factors. And if you have done the diligence and you've come to understand what the smart way is, you have to ask yourself whether your organization is fit for that interface. And if it's not, well, then that's fine. You've got some changes to do to prepare for it.
Africa, again, we just zipped through the region just to give you some flavor to this. I chose Egypt, Chad, Nigeria, Gabon, simply because, well, some of our clients are looking at them, got a pretty good feel for these places. At a subsurface level, they're all much the same in terms of risk. I would say of all of these, surprisingly, I think Egypt, in terms of you're looking for gas in the Nile Delta is by far your best bet. They've actually changed terms, they've adapted to gas markets. And so is Nigeria. Nigeria's investment in new petroleum investment law, which is coming out at the end of the year, I think there'll be some interesting changes to that in terms of gas pricing, but we're getting sort of off topic. And frankly, Gabon stands as pretty neutral, pretty small, not stellar, but stable in our view. The one thing that really spooks, or not spooks, but really you have to be attuned to, is this whole third tier, the gamut of political stability, macroeconomics, the foreign exchange, this whole ball of wax that it pulls everything in. And Egypt is in really bad shape. I mean, I've lived there for well over a decade. I understand it reasonably well, but things are changing all the time in this jurisdiction. It's politically and economically, it's a basket case. I mean, no offense to my Egyptian friends, but there's nothing that's going to help this in the short term. And frankly, I would advise, one thing we would say, as Tony says, it's not as if you can't do business, so you can go in there, but you're going to be exposed to some risks. We can certainly make that happen. Is there a sophisticated set of partners there? Absolutely. These are well-educated professionals, very capable, both technically, commercially, and the law, even though you don't want to get into Sharia law. There are some aspects of this which are quite inviting as an investment, not just oil and gas, by the way, and other sectors, communications, cell phone, import, export of certain types of materials. But the bottom one, if you go to the bottom line here, the rule of law is, again, a bit of a basket case in Egypt, not so bad in Nigeria, and frankly, don't have enough data to make a judgment in Gabon. That's why I've left that one blank. So far, I mean, the time I've spent in Gabon was excellent in the southern Gamba Basin. It's very stable. There's no issues of intertribal warfare. There's no blocking of roads. That's a positive side, but the upside, not so much. In terms of, I don't need to really address the issue of corruption and security, because throughout the region is pretty lousy. And you do have to have the physical stamina for it. You do have to have the process, as Tony quite rightly stated. You've got to have the process implemented in place before you even make your first step. Before you get off that plane in the likes of Cairo, Nouakchott, in Mauritania, or in Lagos, you better be well prepared for that, because there are some real and present dangers in this region. There's a lot of, I think, great, specifically JV and gas opportunities in Nigeria, less so in Gabon. Really, this is what I've just mentioned before, that community relations, probably a bit of a weak point here, because I think in the Port Harcourt area, to the east in the Nile, in the Niger Delta, that really is a problem area for community pilfering, annoyances. Likes of Chevron, Shell have managed to operate there very effectively and engage quite well, but they've got huge organizations to back them up. This is not a small task.
The other interesting correlation that you guys will see is access to reserves and the relationship between that and access to markets. There are countries such as, and this is why these two countries are contrasted here with a spotlight on them. Nigeria naturally has massive reserves. Both Nigeria and Gabon are older production jurisdictions, but the perception is that the reserve upside of Gabon as a country is a lot smaller going forward than it is in Nigeria, and that perception then affects how easy it is to get in to do business as a question of competition. So where the Gabonese held a bid round earlier this year pre-COVID, I think they put up something crazy like 45 blocks. In fact, the bid round was stalled because of COVID. That might have been a handy thing for the government not to have canceled it for lack of interest. But having said all that, if you've got an idea on Gabon that you think is workable, you have much more elbow room to go do that, potentially. It's a much less crowded room. So that's a correlation to sort of keep your eye on. More oil service side, if you wanted to look at it from that way, thinking about Iraq. So we're talking about that, Simon. A small oil field that's almost not worth developing in Iraq produces, what, 25,000 barrels a day?
A well will produce that.
So Canadians, like here again with that narrative, we don't understand how huge that industry or the potential of it is. But it comes with risk, right? So these are the trade-offs that you're playing with. So go to the Middle East, where you also lived.
This is a particularly sort of chalk and cheese environment. What I've got here is UAE, Oman. They're right beside each other, but culturally really different environments, just separated by the Green Mountains. And then over the other side, up the Gulf, is Iraq. And between all of these, the commonality is perceived subsurface access, perceived volumes, enormous. Less so in Oman for sure, but I would say Iraq still remains off the Richter scale. And when I say access to reserves in this case, by the way, it really means from an M&A perspective, going in to acquire reserves from companies. That, I think, is a great opportunity in Iraq at the moment, but it has risks, there's a attendant risk with it. The real distinguishing factor between the Middle East region and the rest of the world almost, it's got lousy terms. They have, no matter what anybody tells you, the fiscal terms are tough. I would say the fiscal terms in the UAE, which is close to my heart, I've been trying for many years to do business there, it's basically a concession agreement. You're just getting a fee for service. There are some small tweaks around the edges, but they've got so much volume, frankly, it's a low margin business. That's why you see the Indian companies, the Chinese, the French, the parastatals going in simply to feed the refineries, because they're not making much on the actual product itself. It's a generalization, but if we move towards Iraq, now Iraq fiscal terms are, well, we're all looking at our watches as to when that's going to improve, because frankly, you've got to have a real, a lot of Pepto-Bismol to withstand that fiscal regime. It's so awful. It's a fee for service, basically. The political stability, hugely stable UAE, Oman. The Gulf region, they have very sophisticated surveillance, security, military, and the ratio of locals to expats subcontinent, Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis that provide the surface to them, is very asymmetrical. The political and security services are most effective at keeping stability. You'll probably test those words in 2 or 3 years' time when there's revolutions and coup in the area, but these have stood the test of time. Iraq, again, is terrible. I mean, there's fights between the governorates between themselves, and then within local clans and chieftains. It's very complex, and for many companies, this is beyond their organizational capabilities. Even if you're a service provider, if you're selling a compressor, if you're just supplying a service, these prove challenging operating environments. In terms of corruption, security, labor, and community relations, fairly good and stable throughout what I would call the Saudi going into Oman region. It's fairly well established. They've stomped it out. It's surprisingly at a high level. It probably operates, but at a level where we operate within the private sector, it's far more doable than it was 15, 20 years ago. Iraq, again, you can see from this, community relations, labor unions is, frankly, the way I put it in here, is preposterous. It shouldn't even be there. It's a zero, it's a nothing. Operational security will kill you in Iraq.
Big difference between UAE and Iraq right now is one of capital. So we've had clients that have looked at entering UAE, and the argument in their mind for why ADNOC would be interested in them is, well, I have dollars to invest. The Emirates have a lot of dollars. They actually don't need your dollars necessarily. And so those decisions for ADNOC don't relate to capital necessarily as what other attributes are bringing to the table. So Wintershall, for example, is very good at dealing with H2S problems. And some of those wells deal with those problems. So that's why the Germans have done so well for the last 30 years there. Iraq, on the other hand, as having mentioned that a terrible field produces 25 to 30,000 barrels a day, obviously the scale, the prospectivity of the two countries is, I think you're saying, fairly similar, Pat. The difference being one country is tiny, like fits inside the Calgary region more or less. The other country is huge. And so capital is a question in Iraq. And that's why Pat's saying, we all keep checking our watches for the reversal of the current terms to encourage new investment, because they're just going to need that to develop the state, particularly after rebuilding on the ISIS crisis, which is great that rhymes. It's funny, I get like the whole rest of the world. I get this slide because I lived in Russia and I've done a lot of business in China. So this is a preposterous geography. Do you like Eurasia, Southeast Asia, Australia? It's like half of the globe, but and Russia. So why do we put Russia up here? Well, this gets us back to the narrative, and it has a link back to the Middle East. The effect of two things, I would say, low oil prices in this year, which were purposely driven by Russian and Saudi interests. In fact, that the price drop in 2015 were animated by a similar Saudi play. So in 2015, that low price drop, as you'll recall, cost the Saudi coffers, I think it's in the range of $700 billion to $1 trillion. This time around, the double down was with COVID, smartly played, I might say. We all know what the effects on Permian producers have been, for example, and that this was a political play to aggregate the supply side for hydrocarbons in the hands of two players, mainly being the Saudis and the Russians. So Russia's on this list because, frankly, if you're going to remain in the petroleum industry for the next 15 years, it's the world's largest producer, or second largest, depending on the month you're looking at it. I promise not to pull the soapbox out, but just a little bit, saying that Canadian and U.S. sanctions against Russia have done nothing but ensure that we have no role to play in the development of that industry, which means we have less political leverage over them, which I would posit has been a failure of our foreign policy. But in looking at Russia, again, perceived subsurface potential is off the charts. Russia has, half of the world's gas reserves? At a moment where gas will be the replacement source for lower carbon burning. So you can see the fingerprints of Putin's planning here. Access to infrastructure, though, is rated at 0. Why? Because at present, the Russians are now reforming Fortress Russia. So you'll maybe have noticed in the papers, Lukoil's left Venezuela with, I think, something like a $3 or $4 billion write-down. All the capital, all Russian capital is being pulled out of foreign nations back into Russia. Why? Well, because that's where they're going to make their play, at home, where they can control things. So this probably doesn't look great for E&P purposes or likely midstream purposes at present, but there will be a giant need for better technology to run those assets. And so there is for sure a role that Canadian companies could be playing in that regard in relation to oil service, construction, et cetera. So contrasting that to China, and this is sort of more for the oil service crowd. One of my previous jobs, I was head of international and commercial negotiation for Husky. So this was probably the last major project that you're going to see a foreign company involved in China was the Liwan deepwater gas project. China's also been reforming Fortress China. Its opportunities will be driven by the China Inc. representatives for the industry. And so, they're two tough jurisdictions, but if you can play in the right niche, there may be an angle for you. Malaysia and Australia were just sort of relative throw-ins. What would be, maybe we should do this slide sometime, Pat, where we compare Australia to Canada. Australians as a nation generally get the international geopolitical narrative better than we do. Why? Well, because their biggest client for everything is China. And so it's in their face daily as a thing that needs to be managed, right? Their subsurface potential, sort of ranked not all that high. I think a lot of the Northwest Shelf stuff has been access for gas production. So they've already commercialized it, and it's been the purview of the big players. It's fairly easy to get into Australia in the same way it would be easy to come here, but what's left and what's economic? And then the other attributes you can see with Australia will remind you quite a bit of Canada, except just as a poke in our eye, I think we rank their political stability a lot higher than ours. But so that's around the world, and I don't know if it was actually 80 minutes. I should time it to be 80 minutes sometime. We had a plant question. Maureen was going to ask about Argentina in particular.
I used to work for an Argentine company. Argentines are real different to South America. I mean, they're night and day. They are so different. And so is their politics, so is their economics. Argentina would be probably one of the last places that we would actually encourage companies to enter at a range of industries, spectrum, should we say. However, as we always say, there are protective little ecosystems that you can enter in. But that subsidy is a shock to me. I mean, I've read about it as well, and I would like to drill down on it. I think it's amazing that they're putting this out, because what Argentina was found, that they had such, their politics was so, the pendulum was swinging like crazy for the last 10 years. Their debt, they're reneging on their foreign sovereign debt, the restructuring of their $100 billion has caused huge knockdown effect to the guys. The unemployment rate's very high in Argentina. They need foreign investment. But it's as if one side of the government is fighting against themselves in terms of restrictions. They have deregulated a lot of their foreign exchange provisions, restrictions, should I say. They have deregulated a lot of the dividend regulations. So in that sense, they're trying, but it's like a little bit too late. But the only reason you're going into Argentina these days in terms of E&P sector, the general sector, is to chase unconventional. And the major players are there, you know, the Totals, the Plus Petrols, the Pan Americans, and they are highly protective. They're very, you know, you talked about Fortress, Russian Fortress China. This is Fortress Argentina. They've been very successful at this. I would also say that just dealing day-to-day issues in Argentina, such as the unions have a huge political clout there, more than, well, clearly North America's hardly any clout left, especially in the States, but the unions in Argentina are never to be underestimated in terms of what it means for you doing workovers, abilities to produce gas, it has schedules for employees and so forth. They will drill you down, and the only effective operators I've really seen in Argentina have frankly been very long-term foreign players and large ones. And even those, if you remember, Repsol had to bail from their joint venture with YPF with their tail between the legs because it was an absolute disaster at a number of levels. You know, as much as I love Argentina, the food, the quality of life there, it's a tough jurisdiction, and no wonder putting out incentives for it.
By example, import rates on foreign goods, particularly goods for oil and gas services, 25% tariff. You either need a very specialized piece of equipment that is absolutely needed and that you could sell cash on delivery, in which case I'd say, great idea, or you're buddying up with what you might call an old oligarch family business, in that they have the street cred to manage these issues and you don't have to touch them. But, you know, a lot of the other opportunities that don't look like those things leave a whole bunch of risks sort of uncontrolled, potentially.
I think you clearly always ask yourself two questions. is this likely to happen? Is this risk, for example, is the expropriation risk likely to happen? Put a probability to that. That's one question. But the second question you really got to ask yourself is, how is it going to affect my business if it does happen? And I think that I forgot to mention it. I think that's always something that as I move through any one of those lines, I look at them and I say, if this happened, how deeply am I down the bowl with this one? So that's a good thing to put in context.